Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to the floating head of Simon TV. Wonderful that you could join me again on another Sunday evening. Tonight, we're going out live on X, YouTube, Instagram, Substack, Rumble, Twitch, Owncast, Resonate Radio in Finland. Whatever platform you are watching Simon TV on, it is tremendous to have the pleasure of your company. Please do like and share this broadcast so that everyone else out there knows that we are here doing this. What a week it's been. It's been a week that's been all about the IPCA report, and what an atrocious piece of documentation that was. It was incredible that something like that was published. It was damning in its criticism of the senior leadership of the New Zealand police. It was obviously a failure of leadership and trust in the New Zealand police and, in fact, the political class and the institutions of our democracy has been severely shaken. But that is an issue for better minds than mine. And one of those minds is Dr. Grant Duncan. He is an author. His academic background is in political philosophy. He has written extensively on the nature of leadership and the nature of trust in leadership. It is wonderful that he could join me this evening. Good evening, Dr. Grant. A pleasure to have you on Simon TV.
Good evening, Simon. It's great to be here.
All right, you've been keeping abreast of what has happened with this IPCA report this week. What were your initial thoughts when you watched all of this go down?
Well, I must say, it's been said before that we run out of words in the end, don't we? Appalling, disgusting. But overall, I feel saddened by this really because, I'm a person who's spent a lot of time looking at how government works and about political trust, but also thinking, how can we do it better? That's been my guiding question. And there's always a kind of optimist in me that, we can rebuild trust, we can do government better. But unfortunately, things come along like this that really shake public confidence because they show that there are things really seriously going wrong at the top levels of our government, and in this case, New Zealand Police. And that, as I say, it really saddens me because it sets things back so much.
All right. Well, the first thing that struck me, Dr. Duncan, reading that report was just how brutal it was. Like normally, these sorts of reports are fairly anodyne in their approach. They're kind of wishy-washy, and particularly with an organisation like the Independent Police Complaints Authority, they tend to withhold being too critical. This report into the McSkimming matter was not like that. In fact, it was the diametric opposite of that. How stinging their criticism was of senior police personnel, their processes, and their efforts to circumvent the judicial system.
Totally agree with you there, Simon. And if I may be perhaps a little bit contrary here, this is a sign of the system working. That the IPCA has been so frank. It does suggest that sometimes our system does actually work. And that comes about because we do, in the end, have officials and people like myself, political commentators and journalists, who, in the end, are able to say it how it is and are prepared to do so. Unfortunately, because of a kind of groupthink and an effort to protect their own going on at the executive level of the police, it took this a long time to be cleaned up and to come out. But yeah, good on the IPCA for being so frank. Their language, I absolutely agree with you. Their language is very frank, very straight. Tells us, well, as I can see, as far as I can see, it's telling it how it is. I suspect there's more dirt to come out in future. But for the time being, yes, I think we should be grateful that officials at that level have been prepared to lay it on the line.
Well, you're right. That is very encouraging, and I think this is why it's just wonderful timing that you've come onto the show, because you are someone who can speak from an academic perspective on the nature of trust in a democracy and in the institutions. Because let's face it, there are many other things that have shaken New Zealanders' trust in institutions over the last 6 or 7 years. But it seems to me, and not to put words into your mouth, that your argument is, well, that's a good thing that we are not trusting in our institutions as long as we have the facility to express that mistrust and the dissent so that we can help to make the system self-correcting through that distrust. Would that be a fair assessment?
Yeah, that is a fair assessment, Simon. And you see, I'm not one of those who goes, "Oh dear, trust in public institutions is declining. Isn't that a terrible thing?" Because if we say that, or if people who are academic or political elites say that, it sounds really patronising. It sounds like people's distrust is somehow unwarranted or undeserved or a bad thing. Well, and I can't. Well, wait a minute. People aren't that silly. If people are distrustful, well, it may be for very, very good reasons. And what we've seen this week shows you one of those very, very good reasons why people are distrustful of public institutions, not just the New Zealand police. Having said that, of course, in my own experience, I trust the police on the beat. Personally, I've had good dealings with them when I've needed them, when I've had to dial 111, etc. So I trust the individual cops at that level personally. I know that a lot of people don't. Um, but here's the thing: in a democracy, you'll hear people say ridiculous things, frankly ridiculous things like, "Oh, a democracy depends entirely on trust." Well, yes, it does, but actually, democratic constitutions are premised on distrust. Now, what do I mean by that? It's really plain as day. We trust no one with unlimited powers. Hence, uh, we have periodical elections. We have limitations of powers. We circumscribe people's powers, and of course, we have institutional separation of powers. For example, between Parliament and courts, and so on. And there are very, very good reasons for doing that. We separate powers in order to limit them. And one of the reasons why we do that is because, frankly, we trust no one, and we shouldn't trust anyone with absolute power. That was the reason for the big civil wars and so forth in the 17th century, well, to a large extent anyway. But also, we think of the dictatorships in the 20th century. We have learned historically not to trust anyone. Everyone, in a sense, is untrustworthy. We can sit here and say nasty things about, say, Jevon McSkimming, etc., but we need to realize ultimately that everyone is a bit untrustworthy. We're unreliable. Maybe if we're given a chance to do something dishonest, we just might do it. Uh, so, hence, we have watchdogs, we have laws, we have rules, and indeed, we have punishments when people go really, really wrong. So, all of those things are there fundamentally because people are untrustworthy. Um, but on the other hand, here's the thing: it's a paradoxical thing, because when we vote in an election for our representatives, and those representatives then assemble in Parliament, we have essentially entrusted them with a whole heap of powers to pass laws, to form a government, to do all of those kinds of things, to regulate our society. And so we are actually trusting people with a lot of power, but we're doing it on a strictly conditional basis. Your powers are limited. You should act within the law. In other words, the people who make the law and enforce the law should obey the law. And it's a pity when you see a senior police officer not doing that.
It is
Um,
true. But many people would argue that those sorts of checks and balances and the separations of powers have severely deteriorated over the last few years, particularly in New Zealand. A good example would be a lot of people lost faith in the media's watchdog role in society when the Public Interest Journalism Fund was used by the Ardern Hipkins regime to muzzle them. Another example is the comity, which is supposed to exist between the justice system and politicians, has through a variety of fairly suspicious sorts of judicial appointments seemed to have exceeded what is right and proper in terms of separations of powers. Now, the second thing that really struck me about the IPCA report was the banality of the corruption. It was really clear reading through the events as it was described in that 130 page report, that the corruption was mundane. It was routine. It was just everyday routine for these senior police officers who knew that they're just, or could strongly believe that there simply would be no consequences for being involved in that sort of corruption. And this is quite rightly so, that it is very seldom the case when there is blatant corruption like this, that there is any consequence. And I'm seeing some of the comments coming through in the chat regarding this, talking about things around like the 3-hour delay that Kiri Allen was afforded by the police before her evidential breath test, about the IPCA's effectively cover-up investigation into the police behaviour at Albert Park and at Parliament. So while I certainly take your point, I think it's very interesting that it is worthwhile for people to be in general distrusting in society. As you say, we tend to do that vicariously through the trust that we invest inside those pillars of our democracy that we expect to be keeping one another honest. And it seems to me that in 2025 New Zealand, that really does need to be reestablished.
Look, I thoroughly agree with you, and I think this is a problem all over the world. And in New Zealand, we should be able to do better because we're a relatively small community. We, comparatively speaking, we have a relatively clean system, believe it or not. I mean, there's worse elsewhere, but don't get me wrong, that's not trying to whitewash or anything. I totally agree with you that we need to do government better. Now, the question is, how do we go about doing that? Now, here's the thing, you can never really cancel out the human factor. So a lot of people say, well, we need some kind of structural solution, and that's not necessarily a bad idea. Someone's suggested, for instance, an Inspector General of Police. It seems to be going to be created. You know, probably, in all likelihood, probably a good idea. But ultimately, that's another untrustworthy human being you've just put into the system. And so a lot of it comes down to institutional design and incentives, as any economist will tell you. But I'm also interested in the conduct of individuals, because we know also from history that you can have the most beautifully written constitution, but it can be corrupted by the misbehavior of individuals, and certain kinds of misconduct gets normalized. No one really wants to say anything. Someone's too powerful. You don't want to upset them, etc., etc. And of course, in the present case, there was a desperation to make sure that a certain person, McSkimming, would be promoted to police commissioner. Heavens, imagine that. He could have become police commissioner. Thank goodness someone stepped in and pulled the plug on him. But a lot of it comes down, or to a large extent, we have to look at our own behavior as human beings. Now, my view is that there's no point in someone like me, who is outside of the system, who doesn't wield political power, etc., blaming the political class, etc. My project had always been, how can we make this work better? What can we do, not just to get better government, but to get better leaders, to get better leadership? How can we go about doing that? But that also means that each of us as citizens needs to reflect a little bit on ourselves as well.
I think that's a good point. I have an article that I wanted to bring up here. What I've got on screen is an article from Newsroom. And whoops, sorry, I've just pulled you off screen. There you are back again. Sorry, I switched to the wrong scene. All right, this was an article that appeared in Newsroom, which I thought was really, really indicative. It seems to me that the national government is very much looking to cauterize the wound here. They're not saying, look, let's fix the system. What they're trying to do is to ring fence it into an issue to do with McSkimming and to do with Andrew Costa, and not let anything like an inquiry go too broad. And this Newsroom article, I had a really, really interesting snippet the other day that I want to read to you. It reads this: the name suppression order was eventually lifted after media challenged a stance by the Crown from a September 16 hearing when charges were withdrawn, a stance abandoned by this Tuesday that could have left McSkimming with permanent name suppression. An affidavit from the IPCA itself was by now presented by Crown lawyers. The suppression lapsed late Tuesday afternoon, and within 90 minutes, police had issued a statement. The IPCA report came out, and ministers and the commissioners held a press conference. Here's the key bit. Without dogged pursuit of openness by the New Zealand Herald, it's a very real possibility a permanent name suppression order for McSkimming would have been rubber stamped as recently as the September hearing. Okay, so what happened there for everyone in the audience, if you allow me to interpret that for you, is this: that Crown Law, on behalf of the National Party, on behalf of Cindy Boy-Luxon, on behalf of Judith Collins, and very much on behalf of Mark Mitchell, knew about the IPCA report 1 month ago when it was released, and they knew the content of it. Then Crown Law tried to suppress that report vicariously by pursuing name suppression for Jevon McSkimming. What do you think, Dr. Duncan? This seems to me to just be an absolute cover-up from the national-led government, trying to ensure that the New Zealand people were not informed of the detail inside that IPCA report.
Oh, look, Simon, you're asking me something that I really can't answer here, I'm afraid. I mean, I get what you're driving at. Name suppression would have been a serious problem, and one has to wonder why Crown Law was pursuing name suppression for that long. I think you're suggesting that ministers knew about that name suppression before, for instance, Minister of Police Mark Mitchell claimed he knew about this whole thing. And honestly, I can't answer that. I just don't know. You're getting me into territory here that I can't answer.
Okay,
Sorry.
all right. Well, that's fair enough. Okay, well, look, moving on to a slightly different topic. I really enjoyed reading your articles, and oh my goodness, I clicked the wrong button and pulled you off the screen again. I really enjoy reading your Substack. And guys, I'll put up a link to Dr. Duncan's Substack. He writes some very, very intriguing articles about New Zealand domestic affairs. It's also worth following his X account. I'll add a link to that too. But there was this bit here from one of your articles about not trusting politicians, which is always going to be an article that I enjoy. It was this bit. As the world faces complex problems such as climate change, the AI revolution, inequality and armed conflict, competent and honest leaders and effective government are needed more than ever. But leadership and government are themselves problems about which people have debated for millennia, with still no universally agreed solution in sight. It's worth noting, for example, that in China, most people tell pollsters that they trust their government. Well, of course, because you don't want your organs removed. Sorry for that interjection. There may be disagreements about how best to govern, but all states practice by necessity some form of government, and the arts of government are ancient. Concern for fundamental political trust is as old as Confucius's Analects. The Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius wrote eloquent notes to himself about being a better ruler. I was really interested that you chose Marcus Aurelius's Meditations for that. What do you think? What would be the sort of the top lessons you think that a Marcus Aurelius would have? What advice could he give New Zealand in 2025, do you think?
Yeah, a lot, honestly. And I think reading his meditations is really worthwhile for anyone. As you read them, you don't always realize that the guy writing this is the Emperor of Rome, because they're kind of like notes to self, telling him, "Dude, get your get your get yourself in order, put this into perspective, understand your place in history, and so on and so forth." He's really admonishing himself, looking in the mirror, giving himself a good talking to. In a sense, we should all do that. And unfortunately, I think what often happens is that the process of political selection and promotion that goes on in any society, including, of course, in a competitive democratic system, is that it tends to select for the wrong kinds of behaviors and the wrong kinds of personality traits sometimes. And it also creates a kind of egotism and defensiveness where people don't want to do that kind of reflection. It doesn't pay to do that. It certainly doesn't pay to do it publicly. Um, as an academic, I'm trained in, just being honest about things being right and wrong. For instance, I just said, "Look, I can't answer that question. I don't know," taking me into territory where I can't give an answer. So, as an academic, I'm trained in that kind of honesty. But in politics, you can't afford to be like that. That's one of the reasons why I could never go into politics, because I couldn't be myself as well, what a person who tries at least to be intellectually honest. I don't say I always succeed, but there I go again. You see, politicians can't do that kind of thing. They can't do that self-deprecating, understand my limitations. I don't know everything. So unfortunately, the competitive nature of politics and the intense, particularly these days, very intense, endless media cycle of scrutiny of politicians tends to select against those kinds of behaviors, which unfortunately, as Marcus Aurelius shows, are really, really useful things to do, to be reflective, to understand your own limitations, and to admonish yourself to do better. And, as I say, we can all do that. We can all, and should all, take a look in the mirror and say, hey, I screwed up. I should do better. I shouldn't do that again. But unfortunately, as I say, I think we have a political system that tends to encourage narcissism. It tends to encourage a defensive, competitive kind of attitude where people don't really want to concede an inch.
No, I think that that's true. And also, we're seeing the rise of the professional political class. But I'm reminded of a perhaps apocryphal quote from Plato, where he said it's words to the effect of those who don't pay attention to politics are destined to be ruled over by their intellectual inferiors. And this was relayed to me actually in the south of France. I was on holiday with a previous speaker of the New Zealand House of Representatives, who said to me that one of the biggest problems that they have in New Zealand politics on both sides of the aisle is that for now more than a generation, they have not been attracting the highest caliber of people. Now, he attributed that to competition with the professions. It's sort of like, if you are a high achiever in business, in the legal system, in the medical profession, wherever it is, architect, whatever it is, there are careers out there which are a lot more satisfying and a lot more lucrative. So we're not getting the caliber of intellect, and you add to that you're also getting some fairly mediocre attitudes towards morality. I think it would be fair to say on both sides of the aisle. Would that be a sentiment that you agree with?
Totally, yeah. When I talk about leadership, I basically would boil it down to two things: trustworthiness and effectiveness. And the two things go together because, of course, if you're effective at delivering public services, people will trust you more because you're delivering things that people need. And that's the basic deal. The basic deal in political trust between, we'll obey laws and pay taxes if you, deliver us a level of security and public services that we need. Um, so you're getting back to your point is that, yeah, we're not seeing the kind of talent that we need. If you look back in New Zealand history, I think this isn't a new problem. We've often, I mean, expectations of education levels are higher these days, but in the past, most of our prime ministers never went to university, weren't highly educated. Some of them, left school maybe at 12 or 13 and stuff like that. Norm Kirk was a highly intelligent, capable person, but he, had little formal education, just for one example. But I think, yeah, a lot of it comes down to that. Those, I hate to use the word moral because it sounds sort of so serious, but ultimately we're talking about morality here. And when I mean, morality, I mean, okay, we accept that people are human beings; they have normal needs like everyone else. But yeah, unfortunately, I think there's something about the present day where we're seeing a level of misconduct. For instance, I remember writing about the 2020 to 23 Parliament when it came to an end. And I asked the question in my Substack: Was this the worst behaved Parliament ever in New Zealand? There was just scandal after scandal on both sides of the House, arising from egotism, competitiveness, just people fooling around doing bad things. I don't think things are getting a lot better. And so, look, I don't have an easy answer as to what to do about it. But and part of the problem too is if you say if people agree more or less, oh yeah, we need better leaders, of course, it's kind of like motherhood and apple pie. Yeah, we need good leaders. But then you ask people what constitutes, in your opinion as a citizen, what constitutes a good kind of leader? You'll get lots of different responses to that. And maybe that's okay because that's the whole point about having a representative assembly is that you have people from all different backgrounds, different personalities, different skills. But I think the point, getting back to a point you made earlier, I think there's a concern that a lot of people who are rising in politics these days have known nothing really much other than politics. They've been backroom operators, uh, beehive assistants or whatever, and then that they've found their way to the top. That's not entirely the case, of course. Christopher Luxon isn't of that kind, but Nicola Willis is, and so was Jacinda Ardern. So I think people are concerned that there's too much of that kind of politics only career in there.
I think you're right, and you would have seen there are studies which of the sort of the personality traits of like Fortune 500 CEOs, and they tend to be people of very very middling intellectual acuity, around about the sort of the 120 IQ, and they also tend to have sociopathic uh, uh, personality traits. And that seems to be somewhat reflective of what you can expect from your average parliamentarian, with, as you say, adding in a healthy dose of narcissistic personality disorder as well. But coming back to the system itself, because I think that most Kiwis would agree that we have systemic issues in the police, and we have systemic issues in our society and in the institutions that form the pillars of our democracy. And what I've been pushing for a lot is for there to be consequences and for there to be accountability. And I think that this is the big issue that we are seeing here with the police, where senior police executives were operating under the assumption that no matter what they did, there would be no consequences. And I can give you another example of that more and more. Una Jagos, who was until very recently, or maybe is just about to finish as the Attorney General. There is a person who unilaterally attempted to impose racial apartheid on charging decisions inside the New Zealand legal system, inside our justice system. She had no mandate to do that. She is a civil servant. There were no consequences for Una Jagos doing that. She has been golden handshaked out of her position, and in a year or two, she will show up having been moved sideways or moved up. Una Jagos, despite having done that, has the potential to be, in the future, the New Zealand Governor General. Another good example is Andrew Costa. Now, that man was obviously not the right man for the job. Rather than there being any consequences for his incompetence, he received a Mark Mitchell golden parachute into another plum civil service position. And we see this all of the time. I've got another really good example from within the police, and that is Inspector Grant Teslaf, I think is how you pronounce his name. Now, as we have seen throughout this IPCA debacle, the police don't look for justice inside our justice system. To the police, the justice system is just a collection of mechanisms that they can use to achieve their objectives. They will circumvent any process. They will selectively enforce the law as long as it fits with what they want, with the objectives that they have set themselves. And this was very true of Inspector Grant Tetzlaff when he decided to unilaterally introduce hate crime laws to New Zealand. You may recall when the Rainbow Crossing investigation, Rainbow Crossing on Karangahape Road a couple of years ago, was white painted over. The good inspector investigated that as a hate crime. Now, hate crimes don't exist in New Zealand. He just made that up from whole cloth. Now, most New Zealanders believe that the laws that the police in our country enforce are passed by our parliament. However, that is not the case. Laws in New Zealand are enforced by the police that are invented by the police. Inspector Grant Tetzlaff is still an inspector inside the New Zealand Police because there are no consequences. There is no accountability for an Una Jagos, for an Inspector Grant Tetzlaff, for an Andrew Costa. And this, I think, is where the system starts to break down.
Well, can I just comment on that hate crime thing? As I understand it, the police were requested to do that as a way of recording incidents that could be registered as hate crimes. As you rightly point out, New Zealand has no law on hate speech or a hate crime. But I think that what was happening there is that the police were encouraging people to lay complaints about uh, incidents that may be motivated by hate. And you can go to the website, or at least I looked it up. There's a page on the police website where you can lay such a complaint. That page says quite clearly that New Zealand doesn't have a hate law or hate speech law as such, but they were encouraging people to come forward and lay such complaints, partly so that it could build up a case eventually for there possibly to be some kind of hate speech or using hate-related crime as an aggravating factor, like occurred in the UK law.
Well, exactly right, and I think that
Yeah.
your interpretation is quite charitable, but that you are exactly right that the police were ahead of the courts and of Parliament. What they were trying to do was they're like, okay, the UK has non-crime hate incidents, which is kind of the semi-judicial approach to the matter, which is now being repealed. I note even by the Starmer government. But the New Zealand Police decided, yeah, we'll have a bit of that. So they were looking to build pressure extrajudicially on Parliament to pass laws that suited them. However, I don't want to live in this country, and I don't think anyone else who believes in democracy wants to live in a country where Inspector Grant Tetzlaff just unilaterally invents laws to enforce. And when he does, I expect that man to lose his job. I expect that man to be standing in the dock in a court explaining himself. I also expect our media to be asking him, hang on a second, what law are you enforcing here? I'm also expecting Police Minister Mark Mitchell to be saying, hang on a second here, there is something going wrong. And I'm not seeing anything like accountability or anything like the institutional mechanisms to ensure that that these things, when they do happen, are properly aired, are working.
Yeah. Can I just say there, Simon, that I did actually make a submission to the Ministry of Justice's proposal about a possible hate speech related bill. Now, no bill ever was introduced into Parliament. The MOJ, you might recall, the Ministry of Justice, produced a proposal about it, and I read it, and I made my own submission on it, which probably I could share with people if they want to see it. But my view was that no, there should not that the law should not use the word hate, basically, because it's an emotion. Um, the law should be focused on harm, the prevention of harm, and of course the punishment of people who do unreasonable harm to other people. And I mean, there are kinds of speech acts that are actually crimes. So, threatening to kill someone, blackmailing someone, impersonating a police officer, committing fraud, all of those things are basically boiled down to stuff that people say, right? And so, if you look carefully at the Crimes Act and other acts of Parliament, the Defamation Act, etc., the law does actually prevent us from saying an awful lot of stuff. Um, but the question really is, when is it reasonable to do that? That's the question. And I think, yeah, I personally would agree with you. I think I'm agreeing with you that a hate speech law is not reasonable. And in my eyes, it's not reasonable because basically it's referring to an emotion. Ever since we're sort of like 3 years old, we say we hate people. So hate is a unfortunate but natural human emotion, and but we do have in the Human Rights Act, we do have a law against the incitement of racial disharmony. And what troubled me was the very sloppy wording of those two sections. And I did comment on in my submission to that proposal that really that law does need to be amended, but actually to make it stricter in terms of its wording, in terms of the bar you'd have to cross. At the moment, I think it's very poorly worded, but there it is.
I think it is too, and I think that we can expect in the next Parliament, if ACT is part of the government, that there'll be some significant movement when it comes to human rights legislation
Well, look,
and
I'll tell you
tightening
what
up a
I
little
would
bit.
like. Time, I'll tell you what I would like, and I'm damn sure that ACT will never do this because I think they're hypocrites here. Is that the thing that really bothers me as a political commentator is defamation. And that is actually the strongest restriction, and I think often unreasonable restriction on my freedom of speech. Because as an individual who has no institutional protection, because I no longer work for a university, I have no one to back me if I get a nasty letter from a lawyer threatening defamation. And I do not want to have to pay for a lawyer to help me get out of it, because no one's going to, I'm going to have to pay for that lawyer myself. And so I find personally that it's the defamation action that is the trickiest one. And I would like, frankly, the ACT Party to start talking more about reforming the Defamation Act and doing something about that. Because if they're serious about freedom of speech, but as I say, they're hypocrites because some of their wealthiest donors are the very sorts of people who'll want to take
Who will
defamation action.
use yes, they will, and they'll use because it's a financial penalty, right, to quell free speech. It is the Defamation Act is to wealthy claimants, as the Harmful Digital Communication Act is to corrupt police officers. And I take your point very, very very, very well, and I will certainly be making very similar points to the people that I know, not least amongst the Free Speech Union. But look, I did want to turn to the chat because there've been a whole bunch of comments flying by that I haven't had the opportunity to speak to. Now, before I do start on this, I do want to express my condolences and heartfelt wishes to regular viewer Tanya, who's both a friend of the show, a friend of mine, and my neighbour. She was bereaved this week, and her family are suffering very, very, very badly under that. And I just wanted to say, Tanya, on behalf of everyone involved with Simon TV, our thoughts remain with you and your family at this time. All right, Real Kiwi Man says, when they brought police and traffic together, that became their decline a long time back. Well, Real Kiwi Man, I don't know about you, but I really miss the jodhpurs that those traffic cops used to wear back in the day. You remember? They look cool. The traffic cops that we used to have in New Zealand dressed real sharp. PLJ says, technology amplified magic powers. Are you talking about the floating head thing? I hope so. Sue is here. Good evening. Sure, individual wrongdoing should be factored in. However, it was concerted cover-up, which suggests a culture in the police. Sue, I absolutely agree. Now, I have been saying that, that the police are institutionally corrupt, and I believe that they are beyond reform and beyond rehabilitation. I believe that the good police inside that organization keep their heads down because they know if they step out of line, the organization they work for will protect itself and has a well-earned reputation for enacting reprisals. The model that I very much advocate for is the French model, where you have the natural tension between the national police force and the gendarmerie. The gendarmerie in France is actually a part of the French military, which is permanently seconded to the Ministry of the Interior. What you have is checks and balances within law enforcement. You have the gendarmerie on one hand and the national police on the other, keeping one another honest. I think New Zealand ought to adopt a very similar pattern we should grow a gendarmerie out of the military police and use that to counterbalance what is happening inside our police force. What do you think of that idea there, Dr. Duncan?
Oh, well, that's a bit of a surprise on me, but yeah, I hear what you're saying in terms of like a check and a balance, and I'm thinking about the thing about New Zealand, of course, is that we're a very small unitary state. So, and I'm sure that people who watch TV will be aware that the United States, they have the FBI, they have the New York Police Department, and so counties, cities, etc., have their own police forces. They have state troopers, and also they have a federal system as well. And you can see lots of police dramas where that can get a bit complicated at times. But no, I hear what you're saying. I don't have if you like, a studied answer to that question, but I like the sound of what you were saying. I think, yeah, the idea of a check and a balance within the police force, as opposed to this single institution, which is actually quite rare, a way of doing police internationally, I would think, because we have a small unitary state. We don't have that system broken up into county or regional or city levels or anything like that. Uh, but yeah, I'd certainly want to look closely at that idea.
All right. Well, perhaps that's something we can talk about another time because it would be wonderful to have you back on the show on another occasion. Please do consider it an open invitation. And just by the way, when it comes to cop shows, the greatest police show of all time is The Wire. Not only is it the greatest television police show, it is the greatest television show ever made. Socialite says, how could it be that the government folk acted so quickly on this, but are dragging the chain so slowly on other controversial matters? Socialite, that is a point that I'm very keen to hammer over the next couple of weeks, is that, there is more here than just McSkimming, and the inquiries into matters need to be broad. The terms of reference of any commission of inquiry, hopefully a royal commission of inquiry, need to be broad enough to let the commission of inquiry go where it needs to go. And Brave Sympathy is here. Good evening. Good grief. What concerns me the most is how much we don't know of what went on. I mean, they were far too corrupt to silence everything. So the level of truth would probably give us piles and PTSD. Well, there's our charming thought. Carl Young is here. Marcus, meaning I think Marcus Aurelius, accidentally looked inside and caught a process. Politicians are limited, and one of information gained, they are still limited. Advisors and consultants are required. The doc is talking sense. He certainly sounds like he's talking sense to me too. Dr. Evo is here, my old friend. I often think back to the other IPCA complaint you showed me from the officer who resigned over alleged dishonesty surrounding Gayford. Yes, indeed. That wasn't actually. Oh, yes. That. Yeah. I'll have more to say about that in the days ahead, Dr. Eva, and if you call me during the week, I'll speak with you privately. Crunkster is here. Good evening. Damien, morality is the issue. Truth is objective, not subjective. Moral values underpin a healthy society, and politicians must be held to the highest account. Well, now that is extremely interesting comment, Crunkster, and that is very much something I want to put to the good doctor. Truth is objective, not subjective. Moral values underpin a healthy society. Now, that is a sentiment I would put to you, Dr. Duncan, that very few leftists would agree with today, because we have this culture within left-wing thought that has evolved from Hegelianism into Marxism, into postmodernism, into critical theory, into queer theory, into Michel Foucault. And it's what's true for you is true for you. There is no such thing as empirical truth. A woman can have a penis. There is a climate catastrophe, even if there is no empirical evidence. All of these sorts of things. So coming back to Crunkster's comment, truth is objective and not subjective. Moral values underpin a healthy society. What do you think of that?
Well, in principle, I agree with that. And I was as an undergraduate, I was trained in experimental methods in psychology, and the point of it was to at least make an effort to try and discover things that we could say were sort of scientifically true, objective, truth or whatever about anything. Particularly difficult though when you're dealing with human behaviour and the human mind, because we're no longer talking about, say, geological objects or animal specimens or stars in the sky or anything like that. So this is the thing you see. Look, in principle, I agree with what those people are saying. And look, my present work is all about the work that I'm doing at the moment. Is all about how different notable people in the past have dealt with, have had to grapple with really, really difficult, dire political circumstances. They've left some kind of record behind as to how they've acted and how they've thought about those things. Not just Marcus Aurelius, but I'm looking at different biographical examples to help me try to understand how different people, like smart people, people who actually have some high moral standards, and who haven't always necessarily done everything that was right, of course, because they're still just human beings like the rest of us. But they've left behind some kind of intelligent record about how they grappled with these issues. And what I'm finding more and more is that here's the thing: is that we will never, in the end, finish grappling with this problem. It's something that every person in every generation has to do for themselves anew. But of course, we can learn from other people's examples from the past. We do, there are role models, if you like, that we can appeal to. So, and yes, I do agree. That even in the field of politics, there are sort of basic facts that are verifiable. To do with dates, election results, different persons who did this and that. So there are facts that we can appeal to. But what I've found with 30 years of teaching about social policy, public policy, political theory, is that I've had to learn about ideas that initially I didn't like, right? Initially I disapproved of them. And when I actually went back and read the authors, the original thinkers who, brought up these ideas, and I studied them and I read them, and I thought, okay, now I get what you're talking about. And what I realized was that when it comes to matters of ethics, politics, public policy, and so forth, we're never always going to agree. I'm sorry, at a certain level, there is no longer an objective truth. What there is values. And we do have in our society differing values. You can't get around that. That's just a fact of human psychology and human society. What the what the art of government requires to do well is to find a way of bringing people together across those differences. It doesn't mean cancelling out their differences. It doesn't mean I win, therefore you lose. All right. My case is right, therefore yours wrong. We see some horrible examples of people these days going, you disagree with me, therefore you should be cancelled or ruled out of the game altogether. You're evil or whatever. No, that's not acceptable in my world of how to govern a society, although a lot of people are doing that in social media and so forth. The art of government is about how do we build bridges across people's differences, not cancelling them out, not pretending that they're not there. So whilst I do agree with the idea that yes, there is objectivity in the sense of verifiable facts that really we should not be arguing about. But when it comes to the tricky things to do with social policy and economic policy, there will always be disagreements because there are differing interests, differing values at stake, and we need to respect one another's values and try to understand and try to build those bridges so we can build consensus and work together and agree to disagree sometimes. There's nothing wrong with that. So,
That's a fantastic answer, and very, very well said. And I must say, I admire your commitment to pluralism, and I think you make an extremely good point about the differentiation between what is empirical truth, which we ought to be able to all agree upon, and appreciating that across the spectrum there is, as you say, a variety of different values and, by extension, perspectives. And the art, I think, that you're alluding to is in forming a consensus on that basis. But I want to give you an example where all of that falls down, because if we cannot agree upon fundamental empirical truths, then we can't have find any sort of compromise in values, because we just don't simply have that terms of reference based in reality. And there was a good example of this that happened a couple of months ago with Chloe Swarbrick. Now, you will recall that that one of the MPs blotted his copybook with some fairly questionable social media posts to Instagram. Now, Marama Davidson and Chloe Swarbrick on the tiles at Parliament were challenged about this, and one of the questions that was put to Chloe Swarbrick was, well, when was it that that you stopped following Benjamin Doyle's Instagram account? And Chloe Swarbrick says, oh, I can't remember when it was that I stopped following his account. Now, here was the problem with it. To Chloe Swarbrick, in her world, all it took was for her to say that she wasn't following Benjamin Doyle's Instagram account for that to be empirically true. All right? Now, when she said that, it was possible for anyone on Instagram to see that she was still following Benjamin Doyle's Instagram account. Okay? So what we have here is an inability to agree upon empirical fact. And it's because Chloe Swarbrick and the vast majority of people who vote for the Green Party had been brought up in a world which rejects the Enlightenment completely. They believe in queer theory, in critical theory, what is true for you, what is true for you. All it takes is for her to say, I stopped following that account for it to be true. While as here on the other side of the political fence, we can see we have the empirical truth that she is still doing it. Right. So well, you see what I mean?
I do, and I'll take your word for it that there is evidence that she was still following that Instagram, because I don't know that personally, but I'll take your word for that. So either Chloe Swarbrick wasn't aware of what's going on her own Instagram account, or she was lying, one or the other. But no, it wasn't true. If you know what I mean, her saying it didn't make it true. If what she said was mistaken, it was simply mistaken. Let's just be kind of simple about this. And so, look, honestly, I have read Michel Foucault and Judith Butler and Karl Marx and all the sort of people you're running down. I think you're being a little bit unfair on them, honestly. But I get what you're saying. What you're querying is a kind of gaslighting, which is based on what's true for me is true, and all the rest of it. And I can say whatever I like, and it kind of makes it true, so to speak. Frankly, Donald Trump is the master at this art, and
he is,
you know, and so there is too much of that kind of thing, and so look, I don't know, this is a problem in politics in general, I agree, and I wouldn't necessarily sheet it home to poor old Michel Foucault. But what I would say is that there is just plainly a lot of lying going on in politics. Now, that is actually, unfortunately, normal. That doesn't mean it's okay. A lot of lying goes on in politics. Sometimes there's certain things that for national security reasons, a leader cannot tell you about. So they kind of have to fudge it, or maybe even tell a lie for the sake of national security. Unfortunately, that permission to cover up or to basically lie or, you know, pretend something isn't the case, there's a bit of mission creep, so to speak, goes on. And I think people sometimes, for defensiveness in front of the media, start to say things that they really shouldn't be saying. Now, fortunately, we have people like yourself and other and those journalists who are really diligent in their job, who do check facts. We have the freedom in a society like ours to be doing those things. That's the job that people like us should be doing. And yeah, I guess what it comes back to is look, as I say, I think we do have to accept that certain things are facts. And I honestly, clearly, I don't agree with you about climate change. I'm sorry. I think the evidence is there. I'm not a climate scientist, so don't ask me personally to produce that evidence. It's not an argument I want to get into just right now. But, you know, personally, I believe you're probably wrong about that. But so check your own facts and do your own reading. But the thing is that what am I getting at here is that part of the problem is that we have so much scientific knowledge these days that, and a lot of it really has consequences for politics and for policy and for our lives as individuals. And so it's natural that the sheer amount of information, the complexity, and the degree of uncertainty in any scientific debate. Let's remember that if you really ask an honest scientist, they'll say that scientific methods only in the end arrive at probabilities. Hopefully, those probabilities are sort of 99% plus, Um, but there's always an aura of doubt and uncertainty in any scientific method. We're never in the end getting some kind of absolute objective.
We aren't, and I'm so sorry to be tearing that you opened up the opportunity for me to tear apart your argument there with the science is settled, which is the thought stopping technique of the climate alarmists who say 97% of climate scientists agree that women can have a penis, and so the science is settled. We get this kind of thought stopping technique. But coming back to Marx, he's actually one of my favorite journalists. Have you ever read any of his journalism?
Not a journalism, no, I have to say, yeah.
Oh well, and I've said this on the channel before, and I think it often surprises people that that what a lot of people don't know about Karl Marx is that for many years his primary source of income was as the European correspondent for a New York newspaper called the New York Tribune, and he wrote these incredibly wonderful articles for an American audience about European affairs. If you've read any of I don't know, for 20 years or more after his retirement, Fidel Castro did something similar. He used to write these really fascinating articles about international affairs and international relations, geopolitics and that kind of stuff. Well, Karl Marx effectively did the same thing 150 years ago. So, in point of fact, I'm actually quite a fan.
Okay.
Michel Foucault a little bit less so. All right. Well, look, I did want to talk about your books because at the top of the show, I did say that you are an author and you have written some fascinating titles. And just for the audience, I wanted to read the blurb for one which is actually particularly salient to our discussion this evening. The Problem of Political Trust: A Conceptual Reformulation. Trust has been the subject of empirical and theoretical inquiry in a range of disciplines, including sociology, is that a discipline? Economics, psychology, philosophy, public policy, and political theory. The book approaches trust from a multidisciplinary scope of inquiry. It explains why most existing definitions and theories of trust are inadequate. And I think that our discussion this evening probably bears that out. The book examines how trust evolved from a quality of personal relationships into a critical factor in political institutions and representation, and to an abstract and impersonal factor that applies now to complex systems, including monetary systems. All right, I think this is particularly relevant to the events of this week. I see it's available here on Amazon. Are you selling it locally as well? Like, can we buy this from your website, or do we have to go via Amazon to get it?
I'm afraid you'd have to go through Amazon. I don't sell it personally, so Routledge have the rights to sell it via Amazon. But yeah, I think the word trust has been bandied about an awful lot, and it pleases me in a way that people are framing this in terms of trust. But part of the problem with the way that people talk about it is that they tend to talk about trust as if it were a one-dimensional thing, as if it were particularly, I think that's encouraged by these trust surveys. Now, I'm not against those trust surveys that ask people, for instance, how much trust do you have in the government to do the right thing, or some kind of survey question like that. And it produces results that might look like a bit of a sort of trust barometer, so to speak, that goes up and down. In the United States, there's surveys going back to the late 50s, and mostly it's been going down. Um, but Yeah, unfortunately, I think, as I say, those trust surveys aren't worthless, but unfortunately, they give us the impression that they're measuring something objective. But actually, if you think about it, trust isn't just a subjective thing, it is an intersubjective thing. It's about how we interact in terms of being reliable, keeping promises, showing up, saying the right thing, not insulting other people, all sorts of things like that that make us trustworthy to one another. And this is a subtle interactional, intersubjective thing. It's how we perceive one another's behavior. And it's something that we do mostly without talking about it. So, for instance, you and I have trusted one another to get to where we are now, talking to one another, but we haven't had to talk about trust. Have we? I haven't asked myself, "Oh, is it rational to trust Simon?" And I think you probably didn't feel you needed to ask that question about me. But nonetheless, there's trust going on in the relationship between us. However, I'm not asking you to open up your bank accounts to me and vice versa. Do you see what I mean? That trust
Yes.
is is strictly limited around certain kinds of activities. But all of this has just been understood between us, and it works really well. And so, most of the time, of course, it breaks down in many relationships where people do things that really hurt a person, and where they're vulnerable, having affairs, things like that, right? Uh, but one of my primary questions in that book was, how did trust, which is initially is something between individuals or within groups of people who know each other, like small communities, how did it become a political thing? How did we get to the stage where we could go, where people could say trust in government or trust in money? How did that happen? So this is a historical shift in the way that people use the word in the English language, and of course in political philosophy as well. So I go right back to Thomas Hobbes, who has actually, you might not realize, has an awful lot to say about trust. He uses the word a lot in Leviathan, and so I go back into the 17th century and say, well, how in political thought did this evolve? And what I found is that it didn't just evolve in one direction. The word gets used by different people in different ways over time. And I tried to chart some of those different political uses of the word trust, and to say, how did we get to the stage then where we have these trust surveys and people are making all sorts of wise pronouncements about the results they get? So I guess my thought in the end that is that, yeah, political trust is something that we can and should talk about, but we should also realise that it's not just a one-dimensional thing. So, for instance, if that article that from the conversation that you quoted earlier, at the beginning of that, I sort of quote an OECD survey that said, uh, 25 or only 25% of people in the OECD trust political parties. Well, surprise, surprise.
Yes.
But but here's the question, is that if you think, I'm not saying that you do, but if someone up there in the OECD in Paris, thinks that only 25% is a bad result, well, what's their optimal? How much trust are you expecting? What would be a good result on a trust survey? That 50% of people trust political parties, 75%? Surely not 100%. I don't know. And so the one thing that I've noticed with these trust surveys, that no one will ever tell you how much trust they want. And I think the only people who expect 100% trust are people like Joseph Stalin.
Yes, it's dictatorial. It's like
Yeah,
99.9% of people
yeah,
voted for him in an election, that sort of thing. Well, that's a very good point. Well, look, I wish I'd had the opportunity to read your book before I had you on the show for the first time, but I certainly will have read it by the time that I speak with you again, because it just absolutely looks fascinating and just precisely my thing. I see you have some other titles on Amazon, and often on very similar topics. Would that be fair?
Yeah, what I did after that was that I decided to go back in history and look at what I call the arts of government. So that's that book, How to Rule, question mark, the arts of government from antiquity to the present. And I was inspired there by a rather daunting 3-volume text by a professor called Sam Finer, who's deceased now, unfortunately. He was at Oxford, a 3-volume history of government, which actually turned out to be rather more readable than than the title suggests. And so that kind of inspired me in a way. But I just wanted to say, well, ask myself, well, how did people do it at different times? And that, it comes back to my point is that government is supposed to be there to solve problems, and sometimes it does, believe it or not. But government is a problem in itself, and it has always been a problem, and people have pondered how to do it better, how do we do it, how should we do it, and argued about it. The Chinese argued about it, the Greeks argued about it, and this history of intellectual thought about the problem of government goes back, millennia, literally. And so there's a noble tradition of debate, not just about the arts of government, but also about the conduct of political leaders, the mirror of princes tradition. So I got interested in all those kinds of things and looked at, the arts of government in different parts of the world at different times. And then I thought to myself, okay, Grant, what are you going to do about this? What are you going to do about this? So I got onto the third title there, which is Government and Political Trust, the quest for positive public administration. In the end, I've got to admit, I don't have the silver bullet. I'm sorry, folks. I don't have. I
All right.
don't.
Well, I think it's. Can you tell me between the good Professor Fines, I think you said his name was,
I know.
and
Yeah.
Finer, between him and yourself, where did Machiavelli feature, if at all?
Oh, look, actually, no. Machiavelli, honestly, he's amazing because everyone thinks of when they think of Machiavelli, they think of the book The Prince.
But they
Um,
don't think about discourses on the first 10 books of Titus Livy.
exactly, you got it. Yeah, and so Machiavelli is actually a much more interesting and constructive character than people might believe,
I
and so
absolutely concur.
yeah, so he's sort of quite up there high in my estimation of political thinkers in this whole business. And so, yeah, we use the term Machiavelli, of course, with very negative connotations normally,
And
and
it's
even
so unfair.
I
Yeah.
know even Shakespeare was, Shakespeare's time, and he was using Machiavelli in that negative way already.
He was, and it's just so inaccurate. It's one of my personal bugbears, along with people using the word decimate to mean pretty much the diametric opposite of what it
Yeah,
does.
they do.
For those who don't know, Machiavelli wrote a significant work on the writer Titus Livy, and it is well worth doing. If you want to know Machiavelli's writing, it is worthwhile sitting with a translation of Titus Livy and Machiavelli's interpretation of it, because essentially he was doing back then in Florence what Finer was doing at Oxford and what you have done in your own book, right?
Exactly. Exactly, but I have nowadays, I fortunately have access to a much huger historical archive translated into my own language from all different civilizations all over the world. And so Finer did that research and inspired me to do my version, much shorter version of that. And Machiavelli really was asking himself, why was the Roman Republic so successful? Why did it work? And he came up with some, really intelligent answers to that question. So I've gone beyond just the sort of Western paradigm or tradition, retrospectively seen as, Greece, Rome, blah blah. Um, and looked at China, Persia, India, and so on. And so I'm particularly interested just at the moment, in a Chinese guy from the 16th century called Wang Yangming, and he's really interesting. Um, so delving into those sorts of things, but yeah, I think so. So what it's made me realize, Simon, is given me a sense of humility and a sense of that long civilizational story of human beings in different parts of the world struggling with this problem that we're struggling with today. It's not all that different when you boil it down. It is different in the sense that, sure, we have these modern sciences, we have social media and all the rest of it, AI, all, it is a whole new problem. But yeah, fundamentally, we're dealing with, in terms of fundamental human philosophical and ethical terms. First of all, human beings haven't got all that much better, um, and and we're dealing with fundamentally similar problems. And it's really humbling to read, and as well as fascinating to read, of course. And so I feel privileged that although I've lost my job now, or lost or left it, I feel privileged that I was able to write those books and maybe hand on some of that knowledge in hopefully more or less readable form. But in that third title on political government and political trust, I started to try and piece the things back together and ask myself, what are the key crises that we've got to face now, as you know, globally, so to speak, in terms of government? What are the key problems? Like the emergence of AI, for instance. How does that change the way we think about government? And then I said, well, where does political trust fall into this? What can we do to, what do people need to do? And not just them, those politicians, but I say actually everybody has to play a part in this, no matter how small our role in society is. What can we do to work on trust within our community, and try to make things better to the best of our ability? Abusing people on social media is not helpful.
No, I agree. I agree. All right. Well, look, we're nearly out of time, but I did want to run
Yeah.
through some of the comments in the chat. Carl Young says, when you establish a conclusion, you may have closed the door to further inquiry, comrades. I think that is fair. We need more direct democracy, says Shortland Chambers. Well, yeah, I think that it seemed to work pretty well for the Greeks, although you had the power of the demagogues, and also the way the Swiss do it with their cantons, with that kind of devolved democracy, that seems to work pretty well. Excalibur Socialite says, I'm not convinced that academics would recognize the truth if it hit them in the face. Well, I don't know. I know a lot of academics, and I think they're pretty good at knowing the truth and certainly arguing about
Yeah,
the
and I'm
nature
certainly
of
going to
it.
take exception to that comment, Simon.
Yeah. How will we know that the police will actually have retrained their staff to not do the hate crime woo-woo? That is a very good point, Socialite, and thank you for reminding me of it, because it has subsequently emerged through OIA responses that the police, while they have removed their illegal hate hub to track those sorts of incidents, have not actually gone back and removed the records. They consider it part of their intelligence system, so they are keeping it. I think that that is going to be something which will need to be looked at down the line. The school board's debacle is just risible nonsense, with Labour and Green parties telling outright lies about the new law, and National has been doing next to nothing about it. Okay, all right. Well, I think that that is probably a subject that I can get on to later in the episode. Excalibur says they're advertising insect protein dog food because climate change. Okay, insect protein dog food? Okay, well, that doesn't sound very appetizing. Shortland Chambers says Rome worked until it didn't, was split into and ultimately overrun by barbarians. Well, yes, that is true, but the history of the Roman Empire is always a fascinating reading, and of course that has an awful lot to do with the schism in the Roman Catholic Church into the Eastern Orthodox Church, I believe. All right. Well, listen, it has been an absolute pleasure, Dr. Duncan, to have you on
Thank
this
you.
evening.
Yeah, it's been
And
great.
tell me, where is the best place for the audience to find your work, to interact with you personally?
Probably my Substack, Politics Happens Substack. That's where I'm most active. I'm not very active on X at all. I don't particularly do much, but yeah, I'd like it if people want to follow what I'm doing. I, for instance, have a thing coming out in the morning about mayors, about local elections, about the. I've got a note in there about the electoral fraud allegations in the Papatoetoe Otara local board election, which actually I think is more serious than these allegations need to be taken seriously, and I think it's actually quite an important issue. Uh, and so that's things like that I write about, but also, if people want to browse through past things, I've got a whole lot of stuff in there about leadership, about what could or would happen to the Luxon government or to Labor, or why Labor lost the last election. All that kind of stuff is thought about on there, so people can follow me on there. It's not paywalled. I would love people to offer paid subscriptions, but you can read it for free. So that's Politics Happens on Substack.
Fantastic. Well, I certainly admire your altruism, and thank you very much
Thank you.
for taking the time to spend it with us this evening. The audience has very much enjoyed your contribution to the show tonight, and I do hope that you will come on again. What I will do is I'll put
Love
up
to, yeah.
links to your social media accounts and to your Substack, which, ladies and gentlemen, you can subscribe to if, as I think you should, support Dr. Duncan in his work. All right. Well, thank you very much for the pleasure of your company once again, good sir. I'm going to play a little bit of music, you guys, and a little bit of cinema while I say goodbye to Dr. Duncan off air. I'll be back in a couple of minutes. In the meantime, you are watching Simon TV. Thanks for watching. To consume more of my content or comment upon this clip, tune in to Simon TV Live on Sundays.